Anyone who's watched much of this channel knows that I hold the Fantastic Beasts films in dubious regard at best. I like them, and I rewatch them frequently, but there's just so many little things that just don't quite seem to align with canon. As an aside, if you would be interested in a breakdown of exactly what these moments are, in my opinion, in the movies, let me know. That could be fun to do. Back on topic, on a recent rewatch of the Crimes of Grindelwald, there's an interesting bit of spell work that I was reminded of on behalf of the film's namesake. What I'm talking about is this little bit right here. And can I just say, this scene is the sickest shit. The way that he just like conducts the music like fire. I look like a cartoon character when I do it, but when Johnny does it, he looks so cool. And there's so many incredible little moments just tucked into the scene too. Like for example, when Queenie tries to get Jacob to go down and join the circle with her, and he finally just comes out and straight up calls her crazy. Chills. Also, not wrong. Queenie is a psychopath. Holy heck. Love the character, but shoo. And then you have that moment where Lita turns back before she tries to break through the fire to get to Grindelwald, and she looks at both Newt and Theseus, and it's shot in just such a way to where you can't tell who she's looking at, and she says, "I love you." Oh, it's just so good. I love it just so much, and it's almost enough to make me look past what is the fire? It just does so many things. It straight up just dusts you if you try to walk through it and you aren't loyal to the caster, it seems like. Then it's straight up just snatching people out of the air as they try to apparate away, but only sometimes. Then it starts turning into dragons and it seems even way more powerful. And then suddenly Nicholas Flamel and all of his friends are casting Finite. And for one, I don't remember Finite creating like a little spell killer barrier in the ground if you just point it at the ground. And two, does that even work against super dark spells Finite? Does that mean that Harry could have just Finite the Fiend Fire in the Room of Requirement in Book 7? Too many questions, we're getting off track. Today, let's discuss. What is this blue dragon fire spell? And where can I learn it so I can use it in my personal life? Asking for a friend?
My initial knee-jerk reaction while trying to figure out the identity and purpose of the spell was to draw a comparison to Fiend Fire. After all, it shares some similarities. Fiend Fire is a dark charm which summons magical flames that are not only wildly destructive, being one of the few methods of destroying a Horcrux, but that also take the shape of creatures. Wild beasts, serpents, chimeras, and yes, even dragons. As mentioned in the intro, we see the spell cast in the Room of Requirement in Book 7, surprisingly by Vincent Crabbe. I'm torn between being impressed that Crabbe managed to learn what I can only imagine to be a very difficult spell to cast, and being utterly amused that he didn't consider the fact that only extremely powerful wizards appear capable of controlling it once cast. You can't just put out Fiend Fire with water, and it rampantly pursues any destructible thing it senses nearby. Given that it can more or less burn away anything, you can only imagine how quickly the spell expands in every direction. Poetically, this included the direction of Crabbe himself, and, well, I was gonna say very sadly, but Crabbe is pretty rotten to the core throughout the entire story, so rest in Pringles, Crabbe. You could have shared some of Malfoy's redemption, but no. I guess he technically did destroy the diadem, so that's cool. Hermione does actually mention knowing about the ability of Fiend Fire to destroy Horcruxes, but says that she had never considered it as a real option given its difficulty to control or stop once started. And I think here we encounter our first possible core difference between Fiend Fire and Grindelwald's spell. That is, its ability to be extinguished with multiple simultaneous casts of the Finite spell. It's possible that Finite could have extinguished Fiend Fire, but given Hermione's hesitance, I doubt it. I get that Grindelwald's spell was halted by the force of several people casting Finite at once, which presumably made it more powerful, but I would posit that 1, this appeared to be a modified version of Finite somehow, And 2, I feel as though Hermione wouldn't have shut down the idea of using Fiend Fire to destroy Horcruxes so readily if group usage of Finite would possibly do the trick. Fiend Fire's ability to destroy Horcruxes also to me suggests that it may be powerful enough to destroy souls. So I think there is likely a power difference in terms of destructive ability here between the spells. Total side note, does that mean that Crabbe's soul was burned up with the Fiend Fire since the spell can destroy Horcruxes? Or do you think it only destroys Horcruxes because they're just like a little fragment of a soul? Let me know what you think in the comments. A simple Pego spell also seems to keep the flames at bay, which we see Lita doing to some success just before her death. We don't know if Pego would work against Fiend Fire, but personally, I suspect not. And I wouldn't try it. For what it's worth, the fire is also different colors, so we can at least say that on a base level, Grindelwald is not casting actual Fiend Fire here, though I do believe he would be able to exercise more control over that particular spell than we saw with Crabbe. In an interesting twist, Grindelwald's seemingly signature spell from the Crimes of Grindelwald film was granted some minor unique descriptors in the screenplay of the movie, which was released simultaneously. This is actually the case for the other Fantastic Beasts movies as well, and the bound tomes are actually quite nice to look at, perhaps something for you to consider for your collection. More on topic, however, the spell is noted to be called Protego Diabolica. I probably should have started with this point, but I wanted to begin with the obvious comparison to Fiend Fire, whose incantation is also quite different, being Pestis Incendium. I think it's worth pointing out that we have no reason to treat stark incantation differences as an indicator that spells are not related. Incantations are not, after all, any kind of taxonomic system like we see in the real world with species names. So while I see this as a firm confirmation that they are different spells rather than being modified versions of each other, it doesn't necessarily mean that their origins aren't related. One final note is that the spell seems to be referred to as Black Fire, which may sound familiar to avid fans of the books. More on that later. The flames in the film appear blue, but I see people online theorizing that the effect is blue to make it more visible and striking on the screen, which makes enough sense to me. In terms of lighting, it is a pretty dark film. Moving forward, I will be referring to the spell mostly as Black Fire or the Black Fire spell. So let's take a moment to break down the prime functions of the Black Fire spell. Firstly, the spell prevents passage through its flames to all but those who are, in their hearts, true allies of the caster. For example, we see Crawl get barbecued instantly upon trying to cross, which makes sense since we'd had a few brief shots of him seeming a bit doubtful of the plans being laid out by his master. However, the likes of Rosier and Queenie cross with no problem. And I think this is the primary function of the spell. It's a ring of protection from enemies, and if an enemy crosses the border, straight up hellfire. This feels pretty one-to-one to the incantation. Next up is Grindelwald's ability to seemingly control the movement and shape of the fire to some degree. While he's casting, the line of fire follows his wand's movement, and after that he seems capable of lashing a portion of the flames out with flicking motions from his wand. I don't actually believe snatching apparators out of midair is a function of the spell personally. I think he's lashing flame from the ring at them. By all indications, the fire simply has to touch the skin of an enemy to instantly incinerate them. In the films, we see apparition taking a crucial second to fully occur, and I believe it's these brief moments that Grindelwald is just taking advantage of. After all, once Grindelwald becomes distracted by Lita, the heroes are able to apparate outside without any problem, despite the fire still being there. This suggests that it's manipulations of the spell by Grindelwald that is causing the snatching of nearby apparators, rather than it being a core function of the spell itself. These impressive manipulations also suggest to me, personally, that the Blackfire spell is easier to control than Fiend Fire, which seems utterly rampant. I'll definitely recognize that Vincent Crabbe and Gellert Grindelwald, not exactly in the same league, but the utter inability to control the Fiend Fire for even a second, compared to Grindelwald just seeming to happily conduct the black flames like gentle music with just sheer precision control. I get that there's a power gap between these two wizards, but this difference is more than a little incredible. I think when comparing Blackfire to Fiendfire, you seem to be trading a bit of power for control. After all, isn't the Blackfire spell's ability to differentiate between friend and foe enough of an indicator that Blackfire is a more subtle and refined form of magic? Finally, we come to the most dramatic trait of the Blackfire that we see in the film, the dragons. Similar to Fiendfire, without the control being present of the caster, the Darkfire spell will just continue to burn just about anything around it in animalistic or I guess draconic, fury. Both Fiend Fire and Black Fire claim the shape of ravenous creatures, and we see this happen the moment Grindelwald leaves the tomb, relinquishing control. It's just interesting to me to see these rare spells that continue after their caster leaves. It's probably worth touching on the bizarre effects of Finite we see in the Crimes of Grindelwald. Nicholas Flamel instructs the good guys to apparate into a circle and stick their wands into the ground, or quote-unquote, all Paris will be destroyed. This instruction alone seems to make sense to everyone there and no one in the audience who knows anything about Wizarding World lore, because they all separately cast Finite to create lines in the ground to contain the Black Fire dragons. The Finite lines turn confusingly into orange fire and begin shooting up to extinguish the dragons one by one, slamming the rest of the flames into the tomb to presumably eventually burn out, similar to the Fiend Fire in the Room of Requirement. I'm choosing to put my hands up and surrender here and accept that I guess this was something you could do with Finite in lore this whole time. I guess I can't immediately think of a situation where this would have been handy in the books. Whatever. So you may have been screaming at the screen this whole time. There is another instance of black flames in the Wizarding World. To which I say, you're right. In the Philosopher's Stone, we see Harry and Hermione trapped in the final room of the series of challenges to reach the Philosopher's Stone. This particular puzzle was offered up by Snape, where those inside the chamber must solve a puzzle to locate which bottle of potion on the table before them will allow the imbiber to pass back through the purple flames behind them to leave, and a separate bottle to allow the drinker to pass through the, you guessed it, black fire to move forward. Could this black fire be related to Pego Diabolica? Personally, I don't think so. My initial thought was that it could be. Perhaps the potion somehow makes you a friend to the caster of the fire. After all, why would any but an enemy need to pass through the flames to reach the hidden Philosopher's Stone? If it was a friend, it would likely be Dumbledore, who could pass through unharmed as an ally of Professor Snape. But someone like Professor Quirrell, an enemy, would be incinerated. If this were the case, I think Harry wouldn't have actually needed the potion. He and Snape weren't the friendliest, but they were at least on the same side against the forces of Lord Voldemort. Of course, he didn't know that at the time, but hey. But here lies what I perceive to be the problem. Snape isn't there tending to the fire, and as we see in the Crimes of Grindelwald, untended black fire goes absolutely berserk. Maybe there's a spell that could keep the fire in stasis when unattended, but in my mind there's zero evidence of that, so I'm not comfortable speculating. Personally, I think the black fire and purple fire we see in the chamber are likely the same spell, just meant to keep people in place outside of meeting certain conditions. Depending on what those conditions are, the flames change color, nothing more, nothing less.
One final question before we close the book for today. Is Pego Diabolica a dark spell? On the surface, I don't know. This might sound ridiculous based on how we see it used in the film and who we see it used by, but a spell being deadly doesn't necessarily mean that it's dark. I mean, if you've played Hogwarts Legacy at all, you can blast just about anyone straight to the Shadow Realm with the most basic of spells. And I feel like, even though it's dubious whether or not that game is canon, I feel like that kind of makes sense though if you really think about it. And we also have to consider that this seems to be a variation on the classic Protego spell, and what could be more good aligned than a protection spell? Could Harry and the Golden Trio, for example, have used this against the Death Eaters? Let's just do the obvious thing, and we'll punch the incantation into a Latin to English translator and see what we come up with. Pego Diabolica. I protect the diabolical. Well, you know. Yeah, it's dark. Womp womp. Thanks everybody for watching. If you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to the channel. But for today, I have been Riley. This has been Magical Theory. Have a magical day.